Hey everyone, Kavemi here with another Reddit story. Today's story is a heavy one about a woman whose sister systematically tormented her for decades. It all came to a head at her graduation party. But what followed was a stunning act of justice that saw the sister get her comeuppance. It's a powerful story of standing up for yourself, even when no one else will. Settle in, enjoy the Minecraft in the background, and let's get into it. The title is, My Sister Hijacked My Graduation Party Mic, Humiliated Me with Lies, then months later was dragged from court in handcuffs screaming my name. My sister Melissa has been mean to me for as long as I can remember. When we were kids, she cut the head off my favourite stuffed bear while staring me straight in the eye and remarked, "Well, now it's realistic. Bears die." If I ever got new clothes, she would borrow them without asking, return them dirty or stretched out, and laugh at my tears. My mother gave me a necklace for my 10th birthday that I had been wanting for months. The very next day, Melissa flushed it down the toilet during an argument, and then gaslit me with, "You probably lost it. You're always careless." School was even worse. She would create stories about me, tell embarrassing lies to my crushes, and insult me in front of her friends. If I received decent grades, she'd accuse me of attempting to make her look stupid. If I struggled with something, Mum would tell everyone that I was slow. My parents consistently dismissed it as sibling rivalry, the standard, "You two need to get along. One day you'll only have each other's" speech. But I quickly discovered that my sister did not want to get along. She wanted me to feel embarrassed and humiliated. By the time high school came along, I had mastered the art of staying out of her way. But she kept digging at me. When I joined the debate team and began winning competitions, she insulted me as a desperate nerd, attempting to appear important. When I was accepted to my ideal institution, she sneered, "Don't get too excited. You'll probably fail and come back." I was really looking forward to my high school graduation celebration. It wasn't only about the party, it was about finally appreciating something I'd worked for without Melissa in the spotlight. My parents agreed to let me host it in our backyard. I invited friends, instructors, and extended relatives. I spent weeks planning it with fairy lights, a taco bar, and a music playlist that I spent hours creating. Of course, Melissa was upset about it. She began with passive-aggressive statements. Why did she have a lavish party? I didn't receive one. She did, although she did not enjoy parties back then. It's only high school. Nobody cares. I'm going to be extremely bored that day. I told her straight up, "If you can't be nice, just stay out of the way." She smirked and added, "Don't worry, I'll make it memorable." That should have been my warning. Everything began out well now on the celebration day. Then Melissa made her move. First, she turned up the music to ear-splitting levels and began playing songs she knew I detested. When I ordered her to stop, she said loudly to my guests, "Oh, sorry, I didn't realise the party dictator was here." Then, when everyone was eating, she inadvertently spilled Coke all over the dessert table, ruining the cake, cupcakes and fruit display I had worked so hard on. She fake apologised in the most sarcastic tone possible. "Oops, my bad. Guess we'll have to diet it today." But the worst thing happened afterward. Melissa took the microphone for the speech I'd not asked her to give while I was conversing with my old English teacher. She began recounting humiliating things about me, some exaggerated, others just made up. Examples include, one time she peed her pants in middle school. She once cried for an hour because I ate her cookie. Don't worry, she's going to be a great college student if she can survive without Mum packing her lunch. Everyone laughed awkwardly, but I could feel my cheeks burning. I tried to take the microphone, but she yanked it away. That was when I snapped. I told her to go. She rolled her eyes and said, "Relax, it's just a joke. God, you're so sensitive." She walked away, but the harm had been done. The mood of the celebration was ruined. People kept attempting to console me, but all I could think was, she did it again. She couldn't let me have this one day. After that, I stopped speaking with her totally. I didn't respond to her texts, calls, or snarky apology, which simply said, "Sorry if you took it the wrong way." For the following 6 months, she tried to behave as if nothing happened. At family dinners, she'd sit next to me and ask about school as if we were closest friends. If I ignored her, she'd say, "Wow, still holding a grudge. You need to get over it." Then over Thanksgiving, she made one last dig. "You're acting like I ruined your wedding or something. It was just a high school party." gave her a straight face and responded, "It was my celebration. You ruined it on purpose. You've been tearing me down my whole life and I'm done giving you access to me." And I intended it. I stopped inviting her to my events. I exited family group chats and informed my parents, if she's there, I'm not. Naturally, the guilt tripping began right away. My mother called last week and said Melissa was ready to talk. She put her on speaker mode without telling me, and Melissa's first words were, "So, are you done being dramatic?" I hung up right away and tossed my phone across the room, where it bounced off my dorm wall. My hands shook as I took it back up and blocked Melissa's number for the 15th time this week. 20 minutes later, my roommate Adam knocked on my door, holding his laptop and wearing a strange expression. He showed me his Instagram messages, and there were 3 new profiles, all made within the last hour, sending him walls of text about how I was mentally ill and needed assistance. The usernames were made up of random integers, but the writing style was entirely Melissa. My roommate watched as I took screenshots of everything and saved them in the evidence folder I'd created on my laptop. The next morning in the cafeteria, he sat across from me and moved his plate away. He inquired if any of Melissa's claims were real, and I could tell he wasn't sure what to trust. I took out my phone and showed him the video Elisa had taken at my graduation party, which included Melissa's entire speech and my attempt to grab the microphone. His expression changed from bewildered to scared as he watched. He stated my sister was very messed up and asked whether I had told anyone about it. That afternoon, I walked to the college counselling centre and stood outside for 10 minutes before finally entering. The receptionist handed me an intake form, and I sat there staring at the section on family connections. There was a checkbox for familial trauma, and I hovered my pen over it for a minute before marking it. 3 days later, I was sitting in Dr. Monroe's office telling her about the stuffed bear and how Melissa had looked me in the eyes while ripping off its head. I told her about the jewellery in the toilet, the graduation party, and everything else. She listened without interrupting, then said something that made my entire body feel lighter. She stated that what I had experienced was not sibling rivalry, but rather systematic emotional abuse. That night, Adam discovered me crying in the common room after my father left me a voicemail about how I was pulling the family apart. He sat down next to me, and I eventually told him everything from the beginning. He held me as I described 20 years of being ripped down and humiliated. He said, "No wonder you flinch when people raise their voices." Later that week, I was alone in my room, going through old family photos on my laptop. Melissa was either smirking at the camera or doing something to injure me that appeared to be playful, but was actually not. She was tugging my hair, grabbing my arm, or treading on my foot as everyone else smiled for the picture. How come no one noticed what was going on right in front of them? A week later, I was studying when someone began hammering on my door. I opened it to find my mother, Marlene, standing there with Melissa directly behind her. My mother said we'd speak it out like grown-ups and began pushing past me toward my room. I blocked the doorway and told them to go, but Melissa screamed that I was overly emotional and selfish. My RA heard the commotion and dashed down the hallway. She inquired whether everything was fine, and I informed her that these folks needed to leave. Melissa began yelling, claiming she was my sister and had every right to be there. Campus security arrived within minutes and led them both out, while Melissa yelled the entire time about how I was ruining everything. The next day, I met with University Legal Services, who assisted me in filing paperwork for no trespass order. The council emphasised that if Melissa's behaviour worsened further, I could be eligible for a restraining order. That evening, Elisa called from home, seeming fatigued. She said Melissa had been telling everyone I'd suffered a mental breakdown in college and was fabricating tales for publicity. Several people we knew from high school had contacted Elisa, asking what was going on. Elisa had been defending me, but she admitted it was getting more difficult because Melissa was so convincing. 2 weeks later, I returned to Dr. Monroe's office, and she handed me a stack of articles about narcissistic abuse. Everything made sense when I read about gaslighting, public humiliation, and how abusers always act the victim when confronted. I wasn't crazy, nor was I being overly sensitive. I was angry, and for the first time, it felt like the appropriate answer. 2 days later, I was sitting in economics class when my phone rang with a call from my father, Aidan. I left it on voicemail and listened to it after class. His voice was exhausted as he told that Melissa had been crying for weeks and that her therapist had advised family reunification was critical to healing. I understood the manipulation right away, yet it still made my chest tight. Adam approached me at the library that afternoon and proposed we resolve my social media issues once and for all. We spent 4 hours in his dorm room building new accounts with fictitious names and maximum privacy settings, barring everyone who might be connected to Melissa, her pals, anyone from high school who could leak information. I wonder what Melissa is thinking when she performs these things. Ripping the bear's head off while staring at her sister appears overly deliberate for a child. Each block seemed like another brick in the wall between me and my former existence. Midterms and papers kept me busy for weeks, and before I knew it, it was almost Thanksgiving. My parents had been calling regularly, promising Melissa that she would be at her boyfriend's family dinner in Chicago and that I would safely return home. Despite my instincts screaming at me, I drove the 3 hours home, assuring myself it would be all right for just 2 days. I froze as I stepped in the front door with my overnight luggage, seeing Melissa sitting at the dining room table with her familiar sneer. My mother appeared from the kitchen, stating we needed to hash this out as a family. I turned around without saying anything, got back in my car and went directly to Aunt Susan's house 20 minutes away. Susan opened the door in her jammies, obviously astonished to see me standing there with my suitcase. But she drew me in and made coffee while I sat at her kitchen table. Over store-bought pumpkin pie, I told her everything, beginning with the graduation celebration and progressing back through years of agony. Her expression darkened with each anecdote until she eventually set down her fork and stated that she had always wondered why I was so silent at family gatherings. The travel back to college was lengthier due to holiday traffic. And when I got to my dorm room at midnight, I saw that my door was slightly open despite the fact that I had secured it. Nothing was stolen, yet everything was incorrect. My diary was on a different shelf. My laptop was open when I had left it closed, and my dresser drawers were not fully closed. My skin crawled as I examined each nook, looking for minor clues that someone had touched everything. Campus security took a report, but without proof of forced entry or larceny, they could only offer increased patrols. 3 days later, I returned to Dr. Monroe's office to describe the incident, and she assisted me in recognizing the pattern of escalation in Melissa's behavior, explaining that losing control over me was making her frantic. We spent the hour developing a comprehensive safety plan that included emergency contact information, documentation, tactics, and particular routines for various eventualities. I was heading back from that appointment when my phone alerted me to an email from an unfamiliar address. The mail included old Instagram photographs that I removed months ago, modified to appear compromising, with my face superimposed onto other bodies in provocative postures. Although the content was brief, Melissa's writing style was instantly apparent in her threat to send them to my teachers. I went straight to campus police, who took the blackmail threat seriously and called up a detective who specialised in cybercrime. She stated that blackmail was a felony and that they could track IP addresses, officially launching an inquiry that afternoon with case numbers and evidence logs. A week later, I was studying in the library when my mother called, distraught and yelling that Melissa had told her I was attempting to have her arrested for nothing. She requested that I drop the charges immediately, claiming that I was wrecking my sister's future due to minor sibling squabbles, but I hung off while she was still speaking. Adam had been watching everything unfold and discussed my issue with his folks during their weekly video conversation. His mother, who worked as a social worker, encouraged me to spend winter break with them at their home near Cleveland. When I visited at their house 2 weeks later, his mother sat with me in the living room and softly validated what I'd gone through, marking the first time an adult had taken my side without making excuses for Melissa or attempting to reconcile. When I returned to university after winter break, the nightmares began immediately away. I'd have dreams of Melissa standing at my dorm room doorway, sitting in the back of my courses, or waiting outside my job at the campus bookstore. The dreams were so genuine that I'd wake up at 3 a.m. I had to check my door lock 3 or 4 times before I could even consider going back to sleep. My roommate began to question my well-being, since I would get up several times each night to ensure the door was closed and the windows were fastened. The lack of sleep made things difficult, but I couldn't stop myself from double-checking everything. 2 weeks into the semester, Elisa texted me a slew of screenshots that made my stomach drop. Melissa had been emailing all of our high school pals on Facebook with a completely made-up story about how I had stolen money from our parents and developed drug problems in college. She claimed that I had been begging family members for money to maintain my habits, which was why I had cut her off. Most people who knew me didn't believe it, Elisa remarked. However, I noticed from the screenshots that some individuals were starting to ask questions and wonder if there was any truth to it. I was sitting in the library trying to focus on my chemistry homework when my phone called with an unfamiliar number. It was the detective who had been managing my case, and he had some news that made me drop my head on the desk. They traced the blackmail emails I'd been receiving to a coffee shop 3 blocks from Melissa's apartment. The security camera showed her sitting there with her laptop at the exact times the emails were sent, and the investigator stated that they now had sufficient evidence to proceed with charges. The next day, I met with the prosecutor at the courthouse downtown, and she explained what would happen next. She stated that Melissa would be arrested, followed by an arraignment in which she would enter a plea, and they would most likely offer her a deal because this was her first violation. Then, she looked at me and uttered what I had been dreading. 3 days later, I was in my economics class when my phone started vibrating non-stop. I came out into the hallway and noticed 5 missed calls from my mother. When I called back, she was shouting so loudly that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She continued telling me I was evil, that I was destroying our family, and that I couldn't be her daughter if I could do this. My father then took the phone and spoke in a cold and flat tone. A week later, I sat in the rear row of the courtroom, Adam to one side and Dr. Monroe to the other. My palms shook as I watched them carry Melissa in for arraignment. She pled not guilty, as the prosecutor had warned me would happen, and the judge freed her on bail with a no contact order, which meant she couldn't approach me or speak with me in any way. As she went out of the courtroom with her lawyer, she turned and stared directly at me, mouthing something I could hear clearly from across the room. Aunt Susan contacted me that afternoon as I was walking back to my dorm. She'd been conducting her own research, speaking with cousins and other family members I hadn't seen in years. Melissa turned out to have been unkind to several of them, particularly the younger relatives. However, everyone was too terrified or embarrassed to say anything. Susan was compiling a pattern of behaviour dating back to when we were young children, documenting everything individuals remembered. The stress of everything made it tough to concentrate on schoolwork. Despite knowing about the no contact order, I would sit in class continually looking over my shoulder to see whether Melissa was present. My chemistry grade went from an A to a C in 3 weeks, and I couldn't focus long enough to read more than a page of any textbook. Dr. Monroe formally diagnosed me with PTSD at one of our sessions and suggested we meet twice a week to help me cope with everything. 2 weeks after the arraignment, I was doing laundry in my dorm basement when I checked my phone and noticed 3 new voicemails from my mother's number. My heart began beating because I sensed something was wrong. Mum never left voicemail messages. When I played the first one, I didn't hear Mum's voice. The prosecutor added, "Witness intimidation charges." The next morning, when I handed her the voicemails, she played them for the court at an emergency hearing that afternoon, and he promptly revoked Melissa's bail. I stood on the courthouse steps, watching through the glass doors, as 2 officers carried my sister away in handcuffs, her hands tied behind her back. I waited for remorse, sadness, or something to hit me, but all I felt was relief, like if I could finally breathe again after weeks. The next morning, a courier knocked on my dorm room door and delivered a hefty envelope from Brennan Hayes & Associates, Columbus's most expensive law firm. My hands shook as I opened it and read the formal letter, advising me to reconsider my position and warning me against irreversibly breaking family relationships, as well as implying that I could face legal action for defamation. Adam found me sitting on my bed 20 minutes later, still holding the letter, and promptly phoned the prosecutor's office while I sat there, motionless. The prosecution urged us not to worry because this was standard intimidation techniques, but I couldn't stop thinking about how my parents were spending thousands of dollars to protect the person who had been hurting me my whole life. A week later, Dr. Monroe set aside her entire afternoon to assist me in writing my Abin Mothin victim impact statement. and each sentence felt like tearing glass out of my flesh. I wrote about the stuffed bear, the Flushing necklace, the botched graduation party, and all the minor cuts in between that built up to 20 years of misery. She helped me find the words when I couldn't, sitting quietly as I cried through chapters describing how Melissa not only stole my childhood, but also attempted to destroy my future. That same week, Adam's mother called and officially welcomed me to stay with them for the summer, claiming their guest room was already set up and ready for me. Melissa went from cruel sister to criminal mastermind, faster than someone failing chemistry class, which now appears to include our narrator, thanks to all of this drama, breaking into dorms, making phony pictures, and committing coffee shop crimes. She sat with me in their kitchen and told me about her sister's decision to cut off toxic family members years ago, and how chosen family may be stronger than blood. And I accepted their offer, feeling as if I'd finally found firm ground after months of tremors. Elisa had to testify in a deposition the next Tuesday, so she brought the video from my graduation party on her phone and showed it frame by frame to the prosecutor and Melissa's lawyer. The prosecutor contacted me later to say that was strong proof of a pattern of public humiliation and targeted harassment, particularly the point where Melissa seized the microphone as I tried to stop her. 2 weeks later, I was helping Adam's mother prepare dinner when we heard a hammering on the front door and my mother yelling that she knew I was inside. Adam's mother instructed me to remain in the kitchen while she answered the door. But I could hear everything as Marlene pushed past her and demanded to see me. When I walked into the living room, Marlene's face turned scarlet, yelling about Melissa going to prison and asking if that was what I wanted, my own sister in prison. When I didn't respond or move closer to her, she crossed the room in 3 steps and slapped me hard across the face, the sound reverberating throughout the home. Adam's mother quickly got out her phone and dialed 911, while Marlene continued to yell at me about family loyalty and how I was destroying everything. Within 10 minutes, the police arrived and arrested Marlene for assault while I stood there with Adam's mother's arm around me, my cheek still burning. I had to submit another police report at the station, and the detective informed me that family violence frequently worsens during legal proceedings, which did not make me feel any better about having to witness my own mother being handcuffed. The next day I returned to my old home while my parents were at work to pack the few items I wanted to save. I sat in my former bedroom for the final time, gazing at every object and recalling how Melissa had smashed my jewellery box, torn my posters, stolen my diary, and read it aloud to her friends. I left the majority of it behind, taking only a few photos and my old debate medals before locking the door on that room and my life forever. A month later, the prosecutor called to inform me that Melissa had been offered a plea deal consisting of 2 years probation, required therapy, and a permanent restraining order, which I considered reasonable. But Melissa refused, insisting on going to trial because she wanted a chance to give her side of the tale. The prosecution said that narcissists frequently do this because they want to perform. They seek attention and the opportunity to play the victim in front of an audience. 3 days after our talk, a parcel addressed to me arrived at Adam's residence with no return address. Inside was my old plush bear from when I was 5. Melissa had pulled the head off, and it was now badly put back together with black thread. The note simply stated, "Fixed it for you," and was signed, "Mom." However, it felt more like a threat than an apology or peace offering. Meanwhile, Aunt Susan had been discreetly documenting whatever she could find, rummaging through old boxes in my parents' attic and compiling a timeline spanning 20 years. She discovered elementary school report cards with teacher remarks regarding my withdrawn and anxious behaviour with my sister. I found my old journals, which I assumed were lost. I found images of me flinching away from Melissa as a toddler. The pattern had always existed, scrolled in a dozen different handwritings, by instructors, counsellors, and coaches who had all sensed something was amiss but had never quite joined the dots. 2 months later, I decided to start something on campus that I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I reserved a tiny room at the student centre and distributed brochures promoting a support group for persons who had experienced family abuse. The first meeting, I sat with my notebook and 3 seats arranged in a circle, watching the door and wondering if anyone would show up. A female named Ashley strolled in first, followed by a guy named Ben and another girl simply known as Kay. We sat for an hour, mostly looking at each other. However, at the end, Ashley was crying about her stepfather, and Ben was talking about his elder brother, who used to lock him in closets. By the fourth meeting, we had 12 participants and needed to move to a larger room. The prosecutor called me the following week to inform me that the trial date had been set for 6 months. I attempted to concentrate on my lectures, but when the notice that I'd have to testify arrived 2 days later, I threw up straight in my dorm room. Adam held my hair back as I heaved into the garbage can, and Dr. Monroe spent the entire following session reminding me that I was stronger than I realised and that I had already survived the worst part. Mrs. Chelsea from back home spotted me in the cereal section at a supermarket shop near college. She drew me into a strong hug before I could move away, telling me how much my mother missed me and how she looked dreadful without me. The guilt hit me like a blow in the stomach, and I abandoned my entire cart right in the aisle. I drove back to my flat crying so hard that I couldn't see the road. 2 weeks later, things worsened. Melissa's lawyer filed a motion claiming that because I was mentally unwell, my testimony should be invalidated. They wanted all of my therapy records, every single session with Dr. Monroe, and anything private I'd ever said. Dr. Monroe sat me down and described what was going to happen. How they would try to use my PTSD diagnosis on weeks against me, and how they would twist things to make me appear insane. The judge limited what they could view, but Melissa's lawyer was still allowed to confront Dr. Monroe about my diagnosis in court. My former English instructor reached out on Facebook after learning about the case from another teacher. She recalls seeing me crying in the restroom after Melissa humiliated me in front of the entire cafeteria junior year. I remembered how I'd begged her not to tell anyone since it would just make things worse. She offered to testify about what she had witnessed over the years. I began writing everything down in a private blog, just to get it all out of my head. The words came out like poison being drawn from a wound. Page after page of memories I had attempted to forget. Adam read portions of it, with my consent, and then held me for an hour while I sobbed into his chest. A month later, my father sent me a letter through my lawyer. He was filing for divorce from my mother after she was arrested for assisting Melissa. He wrote that he had failed to protect me, but he still did not want Melissa to go to jail, that she was still his daughter, and that maybe we could all go to treatment together one day. I read it 3 times before throwing it away without responding. At our next meeting, the prosecutor showed me something that made my skin crawl. Security footage from a coffee shop near my hostel, the library and the parking garage all show Melissa following me for weeks before the blackmail began. She'd been studying my calendar, calculating out when I'd be alone, and organising everything like it was a sick game. The prosecution stated that the premeditation would make the allegation significantly more serious. I was sitting in my psychology course the next week when someone behind me laughed in a high, nasty tone that sounded exactly like Melissa. My chest tightened and I couldn't breathe or think. So I gathered my belongings and fled out of the room. I spent an hour in the bathroom attempting to calm my breathing, spraying cold water on my face, and practicing the counting techniques Dr. Monroe taught me. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in Dr. from Monroe's office, staring at this light bar she was holding, while she discussed how EMDR could help with trauma memories. She shifted the light back and forth as I imagined Melissa pulling my bear's head off, and my gaze followed suit, and I started sobbing harder than I had in years. But the memory felt different afterward, like if I was viewing it through thick glass rather than experiencing it again. Aunt Susan called Adam the next day, crying because she'd been discussing the trial with her daughter Monica, and Monica broke down and told her that Melissa had cut up her wedding dress with scissors the night before her wedding 6 years ago, convincing everyone Sophia did it herself during a panic attack about getting married. Monica had been in treatment ever since, believing she had experienced a breakdown. But now, she knew Melissa had done it and she wanted to testify, and Aunt Susan kept saying how sorry she was for not believing me. My scores began to improve after I discovered out how to compartmentalise legal information in my mind during class, and my economics professor approached me after I aced the exam and offered me a research assistant position for the following semester, which felt like the first typical positive thing to happen in months. A month later, the pre-trial hearing began. Even though I didn't have to go, I read all of the transcripts online, and Melissa's lawyer was attempting to get the whole thing thrown out, claiming it was a family issue rather than a criminal matter. However, The judge stated that the evidence of premeditation and the gravity of the conduct plainly placed it in criminal territory. I was headed to my statistics class on Tuesday morning when campus security hurried past me into the humanities building. I followed and noticed Marlene standing there with a huge poster board banner that stated, "Forgive your family." While students took pictures with their phones, security seized her arms and she began screaming that I was hurting our family and that God would punish me for turning my back on blood. They carried her to their car as she continued to yell, and I subsequently found out she was detained again for breaking the restraining order. That delivery with the old bear appears to have arrived at the perfect time, just after Melissa rejected the plea agreement. Makes me question if Marlene is indeed behind it, or if someone else intended to convey a warning about what's to come. 2 weeks later, the prosecutor summoned me to prep sessions, where she forced me to practice answering questions while pretending to be Melissa's lawyer, in an attempt to make me appear insane or malicious. And she kept interrupting me when I became too upset, urging me to take a deep breath and respond with facts. At one of these meetings at the courthouse, I came across a woman named Ashley crying in the washroom, and when I inquired whether she was okay, she claimed her sister had tormented her for 20 years, and she was finally filing charges, and we exchanged contacts and began chatting every day, because she understood what it was like when everyone told you to just forgive your family. Adam found a USB disk in a box of my old belongings from home, and when we plugged it in, it brought up all of my childhood home videos. And in every single one, Melissa was doing something mean while smiling at the camera, such as pinching me hard enough to make me cry, stepping on my toys, or pulling my hair while my parents were filming birthday parties or Christmas morning, completely focused on the camera and oblivious to what was going on right in front of them. Melissa's lawyer told the Columbus Dispatch a week before the trial that I was a troubled young woman looking for attention and fabricating stories about my loving sister. And by lunchtime, it was all over social media with high school students taking sides. My campus support group also commented on the post sharing their own stories of abusive siblings. Adam's mother, who works in social services, began calling around and located 3 different therapists who had treated people at Melissa's previous workplaces for workplace bullying. While they could not violate confidentiality to testify, they all admitted off the record that Melissa had a clear pattern of targeting one individual at each employment until that person departed or had a breakdown. Even though the therapists could not testify directly, the prosecutor stated that this information would help prove a trend. 2 weeks later, we were seated in the courthouse for Memoriam Crossista. So jury selection. And I watched as person after person was grilled about their views on family. One woman was promptly removed after saying that families should always forgive one another, regardless of what happened. Another guy was cut for saying that siblings argue all the time and that it is normal, so he was also cut. The prosecutor wanted people to understand that family members, like anyone else, may be abusers. Dr. Monroe scheduled an extra session for me 3 days before the experiment began, and something simply snapped while we were talking. I realised I'd spent my entire life keeping my folks from realising how horrible things were with Melissa. I never told them the worst stuff since I didn't want to raise difficulties or force them to choose sides. I was so busy trying to be the good daughter who didn't make a scene that I let Melissa slowly ruin me. The night before the trial, I was in my hotel room with Adam reviewing my notes when my phone called from an unknown number. I answered, and my father's voice was slurred and inebriated, stating he wished I hadn't been born since none of this would have happened to their family. Adam grabbed the phone and hung up, leaving me shivering. The next morning, Elisa arrived at my hotel after flying in from California, where she had moved for employment. We remained up late that night, reading through our old yearbooks, and she pointed out photo after image of me attempting to avoid Melissa at school gatherings. She remembered how professors would assume we were just sisters when I would arrive to class with red eyes from sobbing. The first day of trial began with opening statements, and I felt awful watching Melissa sit there in this conservative gown she had never worn before. The prosecutor presented dates and examples to demonstrate 20 years of escalating abuse, but Melissa's counsel continued to refer to it as sibling rivalry that was exaggerated. Melissa genuinely dabbed her tears with a tissue, as if she were the victim here. The next day, they showed the graduation party film, and some jurors shifted uneasily in their seats as Melissa grabbed the microphone. Her counsel objected repeatedly, claiming that it was prejudiced, but the judge allowed it to be used as evidence of pattern conduct. During lunch recess, I was returning from the restroom when I noticed Melissa in the corridor. She looked right at me and flashed this charming, phony smile before mouthing the words, "I love you, sister." With a mocking look in her eyes that made my skin crawl, I had to hurry to the restroom and puke up. On day 2 of the trial, they called me to testify, and I sat in the witness chair attempting to keep my voice firm. I told them about the bear when I was 5 and how she looked me in the eyes while pulling off its head. I mentioned the necklace she flushed, the clothes she damaged, and the rumours she started. My voice only cracked once when I described finding my bear's head in my backpack at school the next day, exactly where she had put it. Several jurors appeared to be upset by the story. Then came cross-examination, and Melissa's lawyer pressed me hard. He claimed that I was jealous of my successful older sister, as well as vengeful and possibly mentally unstable. He kept attempting to twist my remarks, but I just kept responding, "That's not true," and sticking to the truth as Dr. Monroe had taught me. He asked why I waited so long to report anything, and I explained that my parents had always told me it was just sister stuff. After I finished testifying, they called my old English teacher, Mrs. Keller, who had driven up from our hometown. She produced an old teaching diary in which she had written notes about finding me crying in the hallway on several occasions, always after seeing Melissa. She had dates and details regarding her concerns written down from years ago. The prosecutor called my cousin Monica next, and she looked so little as she walked to the witness stand, her hands quivering as she grabbed a tissue. Monica began about Melissa's wedding 3 years ago, when she was a bridesmaid, and how Melissa had ruined her dress the night before by pouring red wine on it while laughing. She burst into tears as she explained how Melissa convinced everyone at the wedding that Monica had gotten drunk and damaged her own dress out of envy. The prosecutor displayed images of the destroyed garment and text exchanges in which Melissa boasted about it to her pals. Monica's voice cracked as she revealed Melissa liked harming people, and some of the jury members took notes while others looked horrified. After Monica stood down, the cybercrime detective entered the stand with a large folder of evidence and began outlining the internet harassment campaign in detail. He showed me IP addresses tracked back to Melissa's devices, as well as timestamps demonstrating she had been sending me abusive text at all hours for months. My images were manipulated horribly on the bogus social media accounts she made, and she put them on sites I can't even explain. The detective demonstrated how complex and organised everything was, including spreadsheets that tracked when to deliver messages for maximum psychological impact. During the lunch break, I was sitting alone in the hallway when my father stepped up, appearing as if he had aged 10 years since I last saw him. His suit was creased and his eyes were red as he stood there staring at me, before apologising and admitting that he realises what she is now. I didn't forgive him, but I nodded because what else could I do, given what had happened between us? When court began that afternoon, Melissa finally took the stand in her own defence, dressed in an innocent white frock, as if she were a victim. She burst into tears and claimed I'd always been jealous of her and was making stuff up to get attention because I couldn't tolerate being the less successful sibling. Her lawyer asked her simple questions, and she responded with a beautiful voice I'd never heard her use before, blotting away phony tears. The jurors seemed to believe it until the prosecutor began cross-examining her and asking about the video from my graduation party. She tried to deny it at first, but when he showed the video of her uttering that horrific statement, her entire expression transformed. The prosecutor kept pushing and presenting evidence, and Melissa eventually snapped and screamed that I deserved it, because I was constantly trying to make her appear bad. The entire courtroom fell silent, and I noticed jurors slump back in their seats as they finally saw the genuine Melissa beneath the act. The following day, character witnesses testified, and my teachers described how I had been a decent student who suddenly began missing courses when the harassment began. My manager at my university job remembered finding me crying in the storage area several times, and Adam mentioned the night terrors I was experiencing. Elisa gave me texts in which I begged her to help me find out what I had done wrong to make Melissa so angry. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep and kept replaying Melissa's testimony in my thoughts. Even though I knew the truth, the ease and convincingness with which she lied made me doubt myself at first, because that is what years of gaslighting do to you. I stared at the ceiling till morning, reflecting on how she had almost convinced me that I was the problem again, just like when we were kids. The 5th day of trial was dedicated to closing arguments, during which the prosecutor detailed the progression from childhood bullying to criminal harassment and stalking. He displayed a timeline of how things worsened after I severed touch, emphasising Melissa's lack of remorse, despite overwhelming proof. The defence lawyer contended that family dysfunction and sibling rivalry had gotten out of control rather than criminal action that required jail time. While the jury deliberated, I sat in the corridor with Adam holding my hand, Elisa on the other side, and Aunt Susan across from us. 20 years of facts suddenly making sense. Must be like discovering that your childhood house was constructed on a poisonous waste dump. Explains a lot, but doesn't make it any less dreadful. Susan glanced at me and said, "Whatever happens, you've already won by breaking free." I wasn't sure I believed her yet. We'd been waiting for 2 hours when we heard shouts from outside, and security officers rushed past us to the courthouse entrance. Marlene had returned, violating her restraining order once more, and was yelling at reporters that I had destroyed our family while attempting to push through security to get inside. The guards held her arms as she attempted to spring at me through the doorway, shouting that I was a liar who had turned everyone against them. The officers arrived within minutes and detained her for violating the restraining order, while the bailiff instructed us to return inside. We spent the remainder of the day sitting in the corridor waiting for news, but none came. The next morning, the prosecutor found us in the same position and informed us that the jury had requested to examine the graduation video and all of the cybercrime evidence again, indicating that they were taking it seriously. I couldn't eat anything, so Adam kept bringing me water that I couldn't drink as we watched other cases being handled and resolved around us. Doc Monroe arrived around noon and sat with us for a bit, telling me that whatever occurred, I had already won by standing up to them, that Melissa no longer defined me. Something about hearing this made me understand she was correct, since for the first time in my life, I was not afraid of my sister. The 3rd day began the same way, with us sitting in those rough plastic chairs, when the bailiff appeared and announced that the jury had returned. My hands began to shake so badly that I could barely stand up. As we returned to the courtroom and saw the jury take their places, the foreman stepped up, carrying a piece of paper, and I gripped Adam's hand so tightly that I thought I'd break it. Guilty on all counts, including harassment, blackmail, and witness intimidation. Melissa's expression changed from smug to astonished to absolute wrath in roughly 3 seconds. The judge began discussing scheduling, but Melissa sprang up and lunged across the defense table at me, yelling that I had ruined her life. 2 court officials apprehended her, but she continued to fight and kick, making threats about what she would do to me if she got free. The judge pounded his gavel and added, contempt of court to her charges as she was carried out, still screaming. He set sentence for 6 weeks later, and the prosecutor indicated that with multiple felonies and her current behaviour, she faced 2 to 5 years in prison. Outside the courts, reporters waited, and I gave them a brief statement about how I hoped this would help other abuse survivors seek justice, even if the offender was family. Then we proceeded to Adam's house, where I just broke down and screamed for what seemed like hours, while his mother made tea and his father ordered pizza, and they just let me weep. My support group hosted a modest celebration for me the following week, and one woman stated I had given them all hope that they could stand up to their own abusers. A week later, I received a letter from Aidan, with a cheque for my whole education fund, which Marlene had attempted to withdraw before the restraining order was issued. He wrote that he had moved out, filed for divorce and begun therapy, and that he was aware that he had failed me, but was working to improve. 6 weeks later, we returned to court for Melissa's sentence, and she received 3 years in prison, 2 years probation, and required psychological treatment. She had to be forcefully hauled out of the courtroom, yelling that I would pay for this and that she would make me sorry when she left. The prosecutor filed for a permanent restraining order that same day, and the judge granted it right away. Melissa could never contact or come within 500 feet of me again once she was released from prison. If she broke it, she'd be sent back to jail. I could now breathe without looking over my shoulder. During our following appointment, Dr. Monroe helped me comprehend how I really felt. She suggested I was mourning the family I should have had, rather than the one I ended up with. That made perfect sense because I was not sad about losing them. I was unhappy because I never had real parents or a real sibling in the first place. 2 weeks later, Marlene issued a letter through her lawyer stating that she had entirely disowned me. She was removing me from her will and deleting me from the family, as if I never existed. Adam and Elisa came over that night and we lit the letter in my backyard fire pit. Watching those cruel comments crumble to ash was liberating. 2 months later, I went to the courthouse and formally changed my last name to Keller, Adam's mother's maiden name. His family had basically adopted me anyway, and they were overjoyed about it. The paperwork was like removing chains I'd worn my entire life. When I returned to campus for sophomore year, everything changed. My grades were excellent. I received the research position I desired and helped to expand the abuse survivors support group. We increased our membership from 5 to over 30. Trauma no longer controlled me. Aunt hosted Thanksgiving that year for me, Adam, his parents, his sister, and the cousin who testified for me. We cooked and laughed together, and no one screamed, threw objects, or delivered hateful words. Adam's father raised a toast to the chosen family and new beginnings. I shed happy tears for the first time in years. A few weeks later, I contributed an anonymous story about sibling abuse to the university newspaper. Within days, my inbox was swamped with messages from other students who shared their own experiences. Some had never informed anyone before. I organised a weekly coffee meetup for anyone who wants to discuss. During one of my therapy appointments in December, Monroe pointed out that I hadn't addressed Melissa once in the previous 3 meetings. She was correct. I hadn't even considered her. The incessant fear and anxiety had finally subsided. Aunt contacted in January to let me know Aidan had reached out to her. He had moved into a modest apartment, begun therapy, and was attending support groups for parents who allowed abuse. He wanted her to tell me he was working on himself and would understand if I never saw him again. Maybe someday we can try to reconstruct something, but not now or soon. By the spring semester, Adam and I had moved into a tiny apartment near campus. We sat on our second-hand couch one night, figuring out our junior year schedules and summer internship opportunities. My phone stayed silent the entire time. No furious text, guilt trips, threats, or dread. I'd created a life that Melissa couldn't touch, surrounded by people who genuinely loved me. For the first time since I was a child with my teddy bear, I felt absolutely protected. That wraps up today's story. Wow, what a journey from a graduation party from hell to finding true peace. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories with the usual Minecraft vibes in the background. I'll see you in the next one.